takes Briggs back to midfield, and Briggs now returning it over the 40. And there's an injured player down. Boy, I did not like the looks of how I saw him lying there in that field.
A concussion is an altered state of consciousness that results from a trauma. An altered state of consciousness is represented by any loss of consciousness, any loss of memory for events immediately before or after the accident, any change in mental status such as disorientation or confusion, or any focal neurological deficits. A focal neurological deficit is a problem with nerve function that affects a specific location, like the right arm or the tongue.
How long should players sit out, or how do we get them back into the game?
Well, there's a return to play protocol for players. In the GAA guidelines, if you're a child between 5 and 12, you have to have 2 weeks of absolute complete rest before you actually even engage with return to play protocols. From 13 up then, it's a 6-step process. So the first step is really about rest and recovery, where there's absolutely, the player has absolutely no symptoms whatsoever and shouldn't be on any medications for any symptoms. So that's 24 hours later, then you're into step 2. And step 2 is really just gentle exercise, walking, just increase the heart rate, make sure everything's okay. So 24 hours later, then you can move to step 3, which is kind of sports-related activity, a little bit of jogging, a little bit of head movement, stuff like that. Step 4 then is where you get into the sport-specific activities. For GA, it would be, catching, passing, running, quick movements to see what the tolerance would be like. And if that goes well, then you can move to step 5. Now, step 5 is a significant step because it is contact. All the other steps, there's no contact at all. It's all just activity. So you're into practice with contact, and for that you have to have medical clearance. So once you have medical clearance, you move into step 5, which is contact practice. And then if that works well and there's no symptoms, you can move into competitive play, which is step 6. Now, if there's any issues with those steps along the way, you have to rest for 24 hours and go back to the previous step. And so you work your way up towards return to play.
Well, second impact syndrome is fortunately rare, but often devastating and often fatal. Swelling of the brain after what are repeated concussions. That's the way it's been described, and I and others have written about certain cases of that. It can also happen after one blow, and we've seen that, or at least without there having been identified earlier blows to the head, and the same massive brain swelling can occur. So this is without a big blood clot pressing on the brain. It actually is a problem with what we call autoregulation of the blood vessels of the brain. The blood vessels themselves dilate and constrict. And if they stay dilated, they carry more blood in them. And that leads to pressure elevations in the brain because now there's more liquid than there should be. And so if that's happening, the brain under those circumstances becomes very tight, the circulation is sluggish, the brain doesn't get the nourishment it needs, and so under the pressure that the liquid is creating, the brain becomes dysfunctional. Once that gets far enough down the road in its evolution, oftentimes we can't stop it. So early on, in certain cases, with proper medication and positioning of the individual and so forth, that can be halted. And yet, I don't know anybody who's come through that unscathed. If they live through second impact syndrome with that massive brain swelling, they're left with some kind of deficit. It's not just a concussion effect. Craniectomy.
Lately, it's been difficult to talk about football without mentioning concussions. Why? Well, mounting concern over a disease called chronic traumatic encephalopathy, more commonly known as CTE. In the world of medicine, CTE is a relative newcomer. In football, we just learned about it 10 to 15 years ago. Here's what we can say. It's a progressive degenerative brain disease. It is like Alzheimer's. It can start with memory loss, mood swings, and difficulty in concentration, developing into progressive dementia, even possible thoughts of suicide. But unlike Alzheimer's, CTE can also result in significant aggression and lack of impulse control. The big difference, symptoms tend to begin much earlier in life, closer to your 40s instead of your 60s. In both diseases, there's no known cure. Researchers believe there's only one way to get CTE, and that is repeated hits to the head. What happens is that you get a buildup of an abnormal protein called tau in the brain. Scientists do know both the location of the tau and how much tau in the brain determines the symptoms you might exhibit. But scientists don't yet have a magic number of hits that results in CTE. It also isn't known who exactly would develop CTE. There are some players who take many hits and never develop symptoms. Factors like genetics and age of exposure to the trauma could play a role. How do you know if you have CTE? Just because you have symptoms doesn't mean you have the disease. In fact, as things stand now, you can only be diagnosed for sure after death. Scientists are researching how to diagnose in living people. A prominent group of researchers have found over 90% of former NFL players have developed CTE. But remember something important here. The number could be so high because of something known as selection bias. That means the brains that were studied were from people who worried that they had CTE. Also, it's not just football players that need to be concerned. Boxers, soccer players, people in the military, anyone who's exposed to constant head trauma can develop it too.
A terrifying story for parents tonight. A high school quarterback from New Jersey is dead after being hit on the field, and then he collapses.
He just carried himself so well everywhere he went.
Everyone cheers for him at football games, basketball, baseball. He's just a really good kid.
17-year-old Evan Murray is the third high school player to die from field injuries so far this season here in the U.S. And now take a look at this. This is a Friday night game, this last Friday, right here in the Tri-State. This Turpin player hit right there. You see the helmet fly off. His head slams against the ground there in the end zone. Now, Turpin High School tells 9 on your side, Adrian Banker is going through concussion protocols right now, and he will not play until a doctor signs off on things. Our thoughts are with him tonight.